Folks, I think we'll get started, and want to thank everyone for coming along this afternoon. I know there are one or two others who will drift in because I've talked to people who are en route. So very pleased to have our guests from Newcastle this afternoon. I'll introduce them in a minute, and also grateful to all of you for coming out, and especially to Peter Gray and Irish Studies for hosting the event. And also even designing the poster, much of the grunt work involved in arranging this, but we're very, happy to welcome our colleagues from Newcastle this afternoon. And I think we're in for, an interesting talk. Let me introduce them both in the order they'll speak. The presentation, I think, is about 35 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. This is obviously, they're speaking on a topic that's become increasingly important for historians and others in Ireland, and very topical, as people will know. There's a Frederick Douglass Week coming up in April, which, we may have to invite you back for, and there's been some activity, in the city among different organizations. The Leadenhall Library, which Eamon was, running up until recently, hosted a series of talks. The people will know there's a statue now to Frederick Douglass in Rosemary Street, and some events planned around that. So topical, important, and two scholars who are in a good position to illuminate some of the big questions here. Fionnghuala Sweeney is reader in American and Black Atlantic literatures at Newcastle University. 25 years ago, she pioneered the study of American slave narratives in a transatlantic context with her PhD dissertation, which became Frederick Douglass in the Atlantic World, published in 2007. Since then, she's published extensively on the work of African-American abolitionists, the Cuban slave narrative, and transatlantic anti-slavery writing. She edited the Slavery and Abolition special issue, African Americans in Transatlantic Abolition, 1845 to 1865, in 2012, and Ireland, Slavery, Anti-Slavery, Empire in 2016, and a special issue of Journal of American Studies titled Acts of Emancipation in 2015. So Fionnghuala will go first, but let me introduce Bruce now before we get underway. Bruce Baker is Professor of American History and African American Studies, and no stranger to Queen's University. He's been coming back and forth for a long time at Newcastle University. His first book examined historical memory of Reconstruction in the American South, an important book that many of my students still go back to. And he's also published monographs on lynching and on the role of corruption in the New Orleans cotton trade. From 2006 to 2010, he was co-investigator on the After Slavery Project with myself and Susan O'Donovan, and one of the organizers of the 2008 Wiles Colloquium here at Queen's, which became an edited volume, co-edited volume, Bruce and myself, entitled After Slavery. And also co-organizer of a major conference in Charleston, South Carolina in 2010, the largest ever conference on Reconstruction in the U.S. South. Bruce has also co-edited 2 other volumes of essays and a couple editions of historical sources. Sweeney and Baker have been researching the career of Moses, who they'll speak about today, since the summer of 2020, and have published articles in the Irish Journal of American Studies, Slavery and Abolition, and Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America. They have recently submitted a proposal for a critical edition of Moses Roper's narrative. So with that, I'll let Fionnghuala take it from there.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you all for turning out today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to give some broad brushstrokes by way of introduction to Roper, and Bruce will follow with the facts. This is a piece of work that we've been working on really for 3 years or so now, and it's part of a wider project that looks at Moses Roper's life and work. We're casting him as the first fugitive American slave to end up in the UK and to travel around Britain and Ireland to publish his work there. And we consider him to have had a really significant influence in turning the gaze of British anti-slavery from the Caribbean towards the United States. So, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about Roper is that he is a first, but also that he is on the cusp of a turn towards towards the United States. And he's on the cusp of, I suppose, facing British and transatlantic abolitionism and Irish abolitionism with a new challenge, because Caribbean emancipation has been affected through governance, it's been affected through politics, and that's not possible for the British or for the Irish in relation to American slavery. There needs to be a new approach to it. So the work on Roper also takes shape within a larger project again, which concerns the literary, historical and political influences of African Americans visiting a resident in Britain and Ireland in the antebellum period. And I think on the Irish side, I think this provides a certain set of challenges and also a certain set of interesting points. So I think it's something that's been hugely overlooked, actually, in Irish literary and historical studies. I suppose it can't be said too often, but even if we take up something like the Oxford Companion to Irish literature, then there's no reference in there to the publishing history, for example, of African American narratives or of Irish travel narratives overseas, of the intersections of anti-slavery and empire, or of the work of those who frequently worked in anti-slavery as servants of empire. I'm thinking, for instance, of Aurora Madden. More broadly in African American literature, to take a slightly different position on this, what we see is a huge emphasis on the slave narrative as a genre. And there's been enormous and extremely valuable work done in collecting slave narratives, in making them available. But the work that has been done has largely been on the literary work as a genre or as a historical artifact. What hasn't been done is there has been very little address to the materiality of this. So we're very interested in the materiality of Roper's work. We're very interested in the publishing history. We're very interested in the circulation of the work. He's someone who has very little by way of archive. So part of the work that we've been doing has been by way of putting that archive, such as it is, together. Okay. And as we come to Roper, what we're trying to look at in the Irish and British cases, but in particular in the Irish case, is to try and think about the ways in which the fugitive presence, which is very concerned with emancipation, right? Individuals are talking about emancipation, they're talking about citizenship, and that's the challenge that they bring. To discuss citizenship or the possibility of Republican citizenship in other spaces opens up, I think, a whole host of other discussions. So we're thinking through the way in which fugitive speakers, writers, African Americans more generally interact with the complex folds of historical, political and literary culture in Ireland. And this is in a context certainly throughout the 40s and into the 50s, where the environmental catastrophe of the famine is also wreaking very considerable effects on the population. So there's a particular problem there, in addition to what we might see unfolding in Britain. Roper himself is a marginal and often a very little understood figure, and that, of course, is part of his interest. But I suppose we're trying to get at why he is so absent and why so many others are so absent. There seems to be in the American scholarship, although there's a lot of emphasis on Black Atlantic actors, there's a reluctance to address the activities of African Americans outside the United States. And this is despite, if we think of Paul Gilroy's work on the Black Atlantic, I mean, one of his main points here is that African Americans or Black subjects more generally present an excess to the state where they cannot be contained within it. There is something inherently fugitive about that presence, and there is something inherently politically radical or disruptive about it. And that's sort of the point of friction, I think, that we come to when we try and discuss fugitives in a transatlantic context, because they don't fit in the Irish context, they don't fit in the American context, and they don't really fit in the British context either. So it's always friction, and it's always partial, and it's always incomplete. So with that in mind, we're still going to go ahead, right? It'll never be perfect, but we're trying to proceed. In terms of the work that has been done, you'll be very familiar with it, but quite a bit of work has been done on Douglas. And as we come to Roper, who precedes Douglas, what we're constantly encountering is the long shadow cast by Douglas. And I know that Peter has recently done some work on Douglas, which I'm very interested in reading. But Douglas, the work on Douglas now really has become part of the problem, because there's a very strongly hagiographic tendency towards that in that work. There is, of course, a very large and very available archive. But Douglas has increasingly been approached through pre-existing ideas about an outcome to the scholarship, rather than by raising a question around what he does. So I'm frequently approached by people who say, can you tell me where I can read about the effects or the fight that Douglas fought on behalf of, impoverished Irish people, or this group or that group, and a lot of the time that evidence just isn't there. But the point is that the question isn't being asked, the outcome is being presumed, and that's one of the difficulties. So there's sort of a plot that has developed in scholarship, whereby any investigation leads to lionization of a certain kind, and I think that doesn't do justice to the kinds of complexities that we're able to look at if we dig deeper. Okay. Okay. On the Irish side, I was conscious coming to Queen's that sort of there's a very important history here in the history of the scholarship, and I'm thinking primarily of Nini Rogers' work on Irish anti-slavery, tell me again, Ireland slavery and anti-slavery. Yeah, this wonderful work that opens up the field and which really makes this enormous impact, but also sort of suggests ways forward. And although Nini suggested a wealth of ways forward, really that scholarship hasn't been followed up on. And that's really a pity, actually. So there's sort of been a surprising lack of any attempt to trace the activities of individuals, and there are an awful lot of individuals who come in the antebellum period, and this by the time we get to 1960, they're almost uncountable. And I suppose the other thing to be said, the other really important work I think that situates what we're doing here is Richard Blackett's work. Now almost 40 years old, or perhaps 40 years old, and Richard traces the influence of Black abolitionists, and he's very interested in the biography, and he's very interested in what they've done, and he describes them as developing in relation to anti-slavery activism a third way. And I think that opens up the possibility of considering that question of excess, that question of fugitivity and what it does, the kind of friction that it produces. Richard followed up his work, Blackett followed up his work on that early work with work on Henry Highland Garnet, on the Crafts, on more recently on Samuel Ringgold Ward. But we're coming to Roper as someone who, even within that context, is anomalous. So how do we situate him? Well, I'm kind of going to say what we're not going to do, and then Bruce will tell us what we are doing. So we're very interested in the point that Caleb McDaniels makes about the ways in which the study of individuals opens up the possibility of identifying, establishing, and exploring networks of influence, and that's particularly true of abolitionism. Roper offers that opportunity, but he also shows the limits of it. I suppose the speaking against that, I think that McDaniel's point holds true, but I think it also suggests that abolitionism and transatlantic abolitionism is in itself an answer, that it provides a model or a framework into which everyone can eventually be slotted. You just need to find the right amount of information, and that will explain that sort of transatlantic sweep of things. I don't think that's quite true. And I suppose the other problem that we're pushing against comes from the scholarship on the US, which is that there seems to be, and Bruce can speak better to this than I, but it seems to me that there's, in terms of the scholarship that's done now on African-American writing activism and political influence in the period up to 1865, there's a retrospective inference that all of the work that was done by African Americans in that period was explicitly in the service of that outcome, in the service of emancipation. And I suppose our point about Roper is he couldn't possibly have envisaged that in 1835, right? So he's doing something different. And what we're trying to get back into is this question of agency and of what people's intentions were, how they worked through their lives, and how we think through their actions and how we deal with the archive such as it is, how we put it together, and what we can make of it while taking out that retrospective significance that has now been applied. So with that, I'll pass over to Bruce. Switching.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I'll start with, and once again, let me also say thank you so much for coming out and hosting us and giving us this opportunity. I'll sort of introduce us to Moses Roper, a quick sort of introduction. He was born into slavery around 1815 or so in Caswell County, North Carolina, which is right on the Virginia state line. And his father, Henry Roper, was the man who enslaved him. He was sold away at the age of about 6 because of the conflict created in the Roper household, and spent his youth sort of passing through many different hands of different owners and people around South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina. He made many escape attempts, all of which were unsuccessful, until finally in July of 1834, when he was in Florida near Apalachicola, he escaped yet again, and this time succeeded. He made it all the way up to New England, spent roughly a year or so in New England, some time in Boston. There's a lot of backlash against the abolition movement at that time in 1834 and 1835, so it's quite a dangerous time. And the people in the anti-slavery movement who were supporting him decided it would be safer for him if he were out of the U.S. So packed him off to England in December of 1835. And by the beginning of 1836, he finds himself sort of ensconced in London in a circle of anti-slavery people sort of focused around dissenting ministers, especially John Morrison is a key figure. F.A. Cox is another sort of key figure with that, and Thomas Price. He gets some education at a couple of academies and begins in 1836 speaking at anti-slavery meetings. So not the ones he's organizing, but mostly ones organized by George Thompson. And people are keen to hear what he has to say. In the summer of 1837, he publishes a narrative of the adventures and escape of Moses Roper from American slavery. And then in sort of the rest of 1837 and into 1838, he's traveling around the major cities in England to visit anti-slavery societies and sell copies of his book. And so he's mostly just doing that. There's no real evidence that he's doing public lectures at that point until the spring of 1838, when he starts doing lectures and selling books. And he then goes on, by that point, he's pretty well exhausted the major cities in England. In the summer of 1838, he speaks at about a dozen locations in central and western Scotland. There's very little, for whatever reason, these speaking tours in Scotland in 1838 don't seem to be covered by the contemporary newspapers very much, but we know about them because he lists them in a later edition of the book. And then in 1838, he visits Ireland. So I'll go into obviously more detail on that. And the main focus of what I'll be talking about is this tour through Ireland in 1838, and then a subsequent tour in 1854 and 55. And I'll mention a very brief, somewhat mysterious one-off appearance in 1846. So in 1838, thanks to the magic of Google Maps, I've sort of mapped out where he is and where he goes. So he starts in Dublin. He then speaks in Wexford, then in New Ross, then in Waterford, in Clonmel, then Cork, and then finally wrapping up in Limerick. And so he's there from roughly the beginning of September until about the early part of December of 1838. And in terms of the venues that he speaks at, you can sort of see the list there. There's a combination of independent chapels. So the Union Chapel in Dublin, the Independent Chapel on Bedford Row in Limerick, and then also what I would sort of characterize as sort of public venues. That is to say, the Assembly Rooms in Wexford, which is still going as a similar sort of space, I guess, to what it was. The Courthouse in New Ross, the Theatre Royal in Cork. We don't know the venues or actually the dates for Clonmel and Waterford because those are listed in the list of places that he goes in a subsequent edition. But there's an interesting sort of mix between these dissenting chapel networks and more sort of public spaces. The only places that he's at with an organized anti-slavery organization, as far as we know, on this trip are Dublin, of course, and also Cork. It's mostly it's a new sort of thing. He is the first fugitive slave to lecture against slavery in Ireland on this trip, and it mostly goes pretty smoothly, with the exception of Wexford. And when he speaks in Wexford, one of the things about Roper's, he's not a smooth kind of political operator like Douglas is. He's just very blunt. He tells it like it is. He says, I can't come talk to you about slavery in the West Indies because I wasn't enslaved in the West Indies. I was in North Carolina and South Carolina and so forth. But when he speaks in Wexford, he says, well, this particular master of mine and this neighbor planter who was terrible to his slaves were Methodists. And I just thought it was a bit shocking that, good Christian people, Methodists, were treating people this way. And he really seems to have stepped into a hornet's nest with the Methodists of Wexford. And there's a whole bunch of back and forth going on there. And I think that what that indicates is it's kind of hard to tell from the outside. And it's the sort of thing that I'm hoping that the audience here can kind of help me with, is he seems to have kind of accidentally put his foot in some internal church politics. And I think we can kind of compare that usefully to the way that Douglas operates, 7 or 8 years later in the internal politics of the Free Presbyterian Church and so forth. And he's very, very good at internal politics, and Roper's not terribly good at that, I'd say. I think it's also interesting to look at some of the individuals that Roper interacts with, because as Fionnghuala was saying, one of the things we're trying to do with this, and also with the rest of the scholarship on Roper, is to get a keener sense of how his message lands and how people are reacting to it, what other concerns they have, why people are listening, why people are listening in some places and not listening in others. And to do that, we're trying to get a better sense of some of the institutions and networks and individuals that he interacts with. And one of these who's quite interesting, and I think not much attention has been paid to her, is Mary Tuckey of Cork. And she's very involved in the Cork Ladies Anti-Slavery Society with the wonderful acronym of CLASS. She comes from a family that appears to have sort of several estates in West Cork, a number of clergymen. She's born about 1793 and dies in 1870, lives in Dunmanway part of the time and Cork much of her life. She's the sister of Francis H. Tuckey, who's might be known as the author of the County and City of Cork Remembrancer, 1837, which is sort of a big, kind of like one of those mid-19th century historical compendiums of stuff. And in 1837, she had published a collection of poetry called The Wrongs of Africa, and it was published in the wake of a visit by George Thompson, and it was published by and for the Glasgow Ladies Emancipation Society. So there's an interesting link there, I think, between the Glasgow Ladies Emancipation Society, which is sort of on the more radical edge of things, and the anti-slavery movement in Cork. What's particularly significant about her in terms of Moses Roper and why we know about her is that she wrote a poem in response to Roper's visit, which Roper really liked. When he got to Limerick a week or two later, he sent it to the newspaper there, and it was published in the Limerick Chronicle in November of 1838, which was, and his letter is really the first writing by a fugitive slave published in Ireland.
Mm.
And he included the poem in most editions of the book that came out after. So she's quite a significant figure for him. Another interesting person here is Reverend Charles G. Townley in Limerick. He's the minister of the Independent Chapel in Limerick. He's born in London in 1781 and joined a nonconformist church there in 1812. His brother was one of the very first missionaries sent out by the London Missionary Society in 1816. He goes to somewhere in India, I forget where. And Charles Townley also went out the year after to convert the heathen in Limerick. And I think interestingly, he has this chapel on Bedford Row, but he doesn't stay on Bedford Row. He travels very widely on horseback to preach. And interestingly, a profile of him says, to fit himself for this service, he studied the Irish language and became such a proficient in the knowledge of it that he could preach with correctness and fluency. And by the press, too, he did much to enlighten the people, translating and composing tracts and giving wide circulation to these publications to those who were otherwise wholly without proper instruction. He published a synoptic life of Christ in Munster Irish in 1836, and it included a preface going into a lot of detail about the differences in the Irish spoken in Munster from that in Connacht. So he seems to have actually engaged very much with the culture and the population more than you might expect. He left Ireland in 1842 after his wife died, but he remained involved. He'd been involved back in 1831, coordinating dissenting ministers across Ireland to provide famine relief in Connemara. And during the Great Famine, he was in London at that time, but he helps sort of do the same at that point. So trying to get a fix on who some of these people that are hosting and sort of responding to Roper is one of the things we're trying to do. And also trying to think about sort of what's the local context, right? So what are the things that are happening? As Fionnghuala mentioned, Roper lands very soon after the end of apprenticeship in the West Indies. There's a big dinner celebrating this in Dublin a couple of days before he arrives. He doesn't seem to have been there, but that's very definitely a context, as Fionnghuala was saying about Roper being involved in trying to pivot attention from West Indian slavery to American slavery, rather than just, as also happens, some of that energy then goes into focusing on ameliorating conditions within the empire. But Roper and some of the people focusing on slavery are trying to keep the focus on slavery outside the empire. I don't know, again, this is where I don't know enough about Irish history, and you guys do, that there's all of the sort of tumult around the Tithe War in the early 1830s. And I think the legislation settling that happens in 1838. So, and that's, I feel like there's something going on there, because obviously that affects Catholic population, but it also affects these dissenters that Roper is tied into. There's obviously all of the quite, to my mind, complex agrarian unrest and things starting to happen in this period. O'Connell is doing his thing and having big meetings and mobilizing, and also taking a very, very strong public stance against slavery. That seems like a moment of sort of change and mobilization and so forth that Roper's kind of feeding into. O'Connell's in Limerick at just about the same time that Roper is. We don't really have any evidence that he meets. And the final thing, I think, in 1838 is it's the point where the Irish Poor Law Act is enacted. And I'm expecting great things from Peter on that, since he's written a whole book on it. But this seems significant because it is sort of it's about the most downtrodden members in society and how we deal with them and so forth. And it also kind of in some ways becomes important to Roper later. So this is what we would kind of like maybe call the intermission, right? Moses Roper, 1839 to 1854. A lot of stuff happens for our purposes today. It's not crucial. You can read in detail in our slavery and abolition article, but goes back to England. Late in 1839, he marries a woman named Anne Price in Bristol. Crucially, in autumn of 1840, he has a very public falling out with Reverend Thomas Price, who was a very prominent Baptist minister in London and had written the preface for Roper's book. And to make a long story short, Reverend Price had this idea that once Roper had an education, he was going to go off and save souls of the sons of Africa. Whether that was meant to be in Africa or in the West Indies isn't clear. He didn't really approve of Roper carrying on this program of what he called a program of genteel begging. And that's why I think the Poor Law Act is quite interesting, sort of wandering around as an itinerant, giving lectures, selling books, and so forth. This leads to a very public falling out. Price denounces him, insists that his preface is removed from all the copies of Roper's book that are already printed. This puts Roper's business model into a bit of a death spiral because suddenly he's having to pay for accommodation, pay for halls to speak in, and so forth. He winds up moving to Wales, which is his wife's family is Welsh, and we suspect that's why. Spends a couple of years traveling around speaking in Wales. He publishes 3 editions of his narrative in Welsh, which is quite interesting. He then, in 1844, moves to Canada with his family. By the end of 1845, he's come back to Berwick-on-Tweed, which I don't know if any of you would know where it is. It's about 5 miles from where I live. It's right on the border of Scotland and England on the North Sea. It's not the sort of center of the world since about maybe the 1300s or so, when it was very important in wool exports. But he winds up in Berwick-on-Tweed for some reason and publishes an edition in 1846. Travels around Scotland very widely, and this is at the same time that Douglas and Buffum are traveling around as well, although he doesn't seem to intersect with them. He also, mysteriously, at one point in 1846, pops up in Armagh for a kind of one-off speech at a place called the Tabernacle in Armagh, which is, as far as I can see, is another sort of like dissenting chapel of some sort. So he lectures some more in England in 1847, he's back in Canada by 1849. He's in by 1851, he's in Quebec area from 1850 to 1852. The family seems to settle in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1853, and not quite sure where he is in 1854 until October. And then he turns up giving the sort of keynote speech at the Cloher Anti-Slavery Society meeting. So this is an organization that's formed a couple of years previously, and they have, interestingly, written into their bylaws, into their constitution, is that at their annual meeting they will have a Black abolitionist speak. He then sort of travels. I've kind of like drawn what are probably rather confusing arrows to try to indicate where he goes. He goes to Tovermore, then goes to Derry at the end of November. He seems to kind of hibernate through the winter. Don't know where he is. And then he's in Downpatrick, 20th of March, 1855. Another month goes by where it's not really clear where he is. He might be in Belfast. He might spend the winter in Belfast. We're not quite sure. We know he's in Belfast at one point because people get letters from him from Belfast, apparently. He turns up, gives a lecture in Grey Abbey at the end of April, disappears for another month. He's in Athlone about the 30th of May, lecture in Ballinasloe on the 31st of May. He's in Cavan sometime between the 1st and the 6th. He might be there for the whole week, enjoying the hospitality. But his next appearance is at Brookborough in Fermanagh in 7th of June. He's in Enniskillen for a couple of days, then Sligo, then Ballina, then Boyle, and 3 last appearances in the first days of July in Portlaoise, whatever it was called then, Abbey Lakes and Port Arlington. And then he's back over to England later in 1855. Now, sort of looking at, again, the speaking venues here, it's sort of similar, except they're probably mostly public venues, especially courthouses. And I put a picture of the courthouse in Clogher here just to give you an impression. It's not a huge building. It's a small place. He also speaks at the Protestant Hall in Brookborough. But he also speaks at, as you might expect, quite a lot of Presbyterian churches and a couple of Baptist churches on that itinerary. In terms of people that turn up, I think one of the interesting people is Isabella Moutray Waring Maxwell. So she's born and she's the sort of the key figure in the Clogher Anti-Slavery Society. She's born in 1799 at a estate called Favor Royal, sort of near Auchnacoy and Augher. Her father is a guy named John Corey Moutray. A colleague of mine who sort of studies landed gentry in Northern Ireland would know exactly who all these people are. But they're really major landholding families that are involved in this Clogher Anti-Slavery Society. And she gets involved in the anti-slavery movement through Julia Griffiths, right, who's sort of a link to Frederick Douglass and is sort of spearheads a number of local anti-slavery societies in Ireland, Scotland, and England. There's not really a lot of other sort of significant figures that he bumps into on this trip that we're aware of. But when we start thinking about the context for 54, 55, I think one of the interesting things about Roper is that he's here a few years before the famine, and he's here a few years after the famine. And obviously, the place changes in so many different ways. And that's really sort of key. And, I won't really say much more, except I think that's significant. There's also one of those tiny little fragments of information. So after he's at Brookborough, in November of 1854, about a couple of weeks after he's there, there's a brief little item that says a tenant right and anti-slavery society is being formed in Brookborough. That's all the information I have on it. And it's interesting to know, was it just one meeting? Did it carry on? Who was involved? What did they do? And so forth. But it's interesting and tantalizing, just that idea that there were at least more people than one who thought there's some connection there. Another thing, of course, that's happened is O'Connell has died in 1847, and I think that sort of changes the dynamic along with everything else. It's also, to come back to points that Richard Blackett made a long time ago, it's after the Fugitive Slave Act in America in 1850. And what that means is that if you were a fugitive slave who escaped out of the slaveholding states to the north, you're pretty much fine, especially if your neighbors were willing to sort of stick up for you and, sort of keep the people off of you if they came to recapture you. But after the Fugitive Slave Act, it puts lots of pressure, and people can be fined thousands and thousands of dollars and go to jail if they don't cooperate with that. So at that point, a lot of fugitive slaves who had been in America suddenly in the northern states no longer feel safe. A lot of them move to Canada, but you also get quite an influx to Britain and Ireland of Black abolitionists who are, and also just not abolitionists, but just fugitive slaves who find it safer. He's also touring around right during the Crimean War. I don't know if that's significant, but it might be. So just kind of in closing, I think with abolitionism or a lot of social movements, right, when we study them, there's maybe a tendency to focus on the message and on the messenger. And that's partly because we have the evidence for that, right? So we have the things that are published, we have the accounts of the speeches, we can identify who the speaker was, as we do with Douglass, as we try. It's a bit harder to do with Roper. But last of all, we focus on the audience, right? So there are all these speeches, but who's coming to them? Why are they coming to them? What other things are they going to? What other issues concern them in Brookborough? What other issues concern them in Sheffield? What other issues concern them in Vermont, you know, at different times and so forth. And I think it's important, if we're going to understand the anti-slavery movement, to understand not just who's sending this message out and what they're saying about slavery, but why people care. You know, how does that resonate with them? How does that move them to do things? And how does it, you know, vary from place to place and from time to time? So that's one of the things we're trying to sort of figure out. And I think an example of that, where that has been done really well, of course, is again to fall back on Frederick Douglass and the Send Back the Money campaign. But surely that sort of thing, maybe not quite that involved, but that sort of understanding of why people were responding to the anti-slavery message in particular ways is out there for all of these. And I think if we're going to get a good sense of how anti-slavery works, it's important to understand that and not to kind of cast back in a very quite too easy sort of way of slavery's bad, and of course people don't like it. And so if somebody comes and says, I was enslaved and it was bad, of course you're going to jump in and help. You know, that's obvious, but it doesn't really tell us much. And I think we need to try to dig in and find out more. And the other thing is we are trying to understand more about the messenger here, about Moses Roper, partly because I think that in contrast to Douglass, who's sort of the archetype of all this, who's very institutionally connected, he's very politically active, he's very, you know, supports a lot of things, does a lot of things, is well supported. Roper is, you know, we know of him because of his slave narrative and his campaigning against slavery. But as I've indicated, there are vast periods of time where he just disappears from the historical record. And we've kind of hit the point where we think we've exhausted trying to chase up little leads and just kind of have to go with what we have here. But what is he doing in all those years where he doesn't turn up? You know, so I think what's interesting to me about that is he is an anti-slavery campaigner, but that's not the only thing he does. And I think it would help us understand his anti-slavery work if we sort of understand that in the context of a life where he did that, and that was important to him all the way through to the end of his life, but it wasn't the only thing he did. And we may never know a lot about the other things he did. I've put a list of things that we've written about Roper so far over there, in case you want to fill in any of the gaps that I skimmed over. But I would welcome questions and suggestions and things to read and things to look at and so forth. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Really interesting event. I suppose raises as many questions as it answers, and plenty to discuss. I was struck when Bruce was commenting at the end about audience and reception. I remember reading first time I read through Nini Rocha's, you know, very important work on this topic, that she concluded, and I don't remember the evidence she used to come to this conclusion, but her conclusion was that quite a number of the people who came to hear Douglass speak in Cork, I think it was in 1854, does that sound right?
Probably 40. Douglass and Cork.
45.
Okay. That many of them were there to hear about conditions in the United States because they were anxious to emigrate. They wanted to get out. Now, I don't, you know, it raised an eyebrow when I read it at the time, but it does, whether it's, you know, we can verify that or not, it does raise interesting questions about the motivations of people who come along to hear somebody like Douglass in, you know, particularly in kind of rural areas across Ireland. So lots there. I'm just going to open it up and ask people, you know, come in.
Picking up a number of points, and it's an incredibly obvious question in sorts of ways, but what's his motivation? And I'm asking that because, you know, he's leaving the States for personal safety reasons, it seems. He then finds a kind of home in Proverbs terms of the central community, but he's then using public halls, well, church halls. He has the fallout with Price, because he speaks against Methodism, Jew Methodists. He does all of those sort. Is he identifying primarily as an anti-slavery campaigner, or is that something that he's doing while he's living a life? And it's really just trying to, I mean, just picking up, I think, on the last point you were making, Bruce, you know, it's just trying to get at how he sees his exercise of his own agency and what sorts of expectations is he having to fight against to do what he wants to do. I don't know if that's at all answerable. But...
Do you want to take a few questions or go back and forth? Do you want to respond directly or?
Yeah, show me maybe. He certainly does sort of come over really for his own safety initially. And then I think it's through this sort of gradual involvement in anti-slavery, right? So he goes along because the people who are supporting him are very active in anti-slavery things and sort of help him get some education. And he goes along to George Thompson's speeches, and he goes along to, there's sort of a big thing where the English Baptists have sent a couple of delegates over to a big meeting in America, and they were supposed to speak up against slavery. And when they got there, they kind of chickened out. And there's a big meeting in London to sort of grill them on why they didn't do that and so forth. And Roper speaks there as well. And he tells stories about his own experience. And it really grabs people's attention. So then, you know, at some point they say, well, you should write this up. And he does. And so he does certainly identify himself very much as an anti-slavery campaigner. And really from the time he publishes the book in the beginning of August 1837, we've got very, very good coverage of where he is and what he's doing for much of the time until he disappears into Wales in 1841. And then when he's in Wales, 1841, 1842, we know he's at a lot of different places. We have fewer sort of like dates we can pin him down and so forth. But then even continuing until he leaves England in sometime in sort of summer, I think, of 1844. There's some gaps, but he's all over the place. He's all over the place lecturing, and eventually in the second Barrack edition of his book, 1848, in the appendix, he has a list of the places that he spoke, sort of broken down by different denominations and so forth. And he spoke at somewhere around 2,000 different locations. I mean, places where, like little places in Berwickshire, Scotland, that simply aren't even places anymore, you know, in addition to, you know, like big cities and so forth. So he was very much, I think, in those early years, very much a anti-slavery lecturer. He pops up, I think he pops up on a census at least once as a lecturer. So he does very much see himself as a lecturer. It's also a way, it's also a living, you know, this selling the books. And he's also very adamant in the early years about, and this is where he has this falling out with Price. He says, I'm not a beggar. You know, I was, you know, penniless on the streets of Manchester for 5 days when I first got here and didn't know anybody, and I refused to beg. But he really prides himself in that early stage on making his own way and living by selling the books and not taking up collections. Later in his life, where he disappears for years, we're not sure. We're not sure what he's doing. It seems like if he continued to lecture at that sort of pace, that he would pop up somewhere in the newspaper in, you know, 1852, 1853 or something like that. And he doesn't. So we figure he must be making his living, earning his bread some other way. And I think at that point, the anti-slavery campaigner identity becomes one of his identities, but I'm not sure what else. So what else?
It's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
You know, just add to that one of the things that we see happening with Rupert is that he develops faith. And after his escape from Florida, he arrives in, I think he's wandering around New England, but there's a point at which he begins to learn to read, and of course he memorizes passages from Matthew, and that sort of sparks the beginning of a religious conversion or the beginnings of his faith. So when he comes to when he comes to Britain and he's resident in London, he eventually enters into a congregation formally and becomes a member of that congregation, becomes a Baptist. So I think that so by the time he steps onto the platform with George Thompson, that what he has sort of become used to is this idea of testimony, of the possibility of voice within this context. And there's an idea of truth speaking, I think, that emerges in his work, and that's sort of a different sort of, it's a less economic point, but I think in terms of developing a voice, I think that the dissenting culture in which he immerses himself, and into which he becomes a member of the congregation, becomes really important in how he sees himself, in the message that he delivers. And I mean, it's very hard to say, because we would describe him as an abolitionist, but again, I don't think that he's advocating for abolition, because I just don't even think that is conceptually possible in this moment. But I think that what is possible is a moral argument about slavery, is a testimony around what actually is going on. It seems to me to be a slightly different thing, but maybe it speaks a little to his motivation in that. His motivation is to speak about this and to speak.
And then also, just if I can tag on to the end of that, so he pops up doing lectures until 1861, sort of early summer of 1861, then sort of disappears, and turns up again in Vermont in 1882, doing lectures on his experience as a slave and living in England and so forth. He eventually dies in Boston in 1891, but where he is for that 20 years, we don't really know. We've only recently found one newspaper article from near Toronto in 1876 where he's given a lecture. So we know he was there. But what is interesting is that there are various documents in that period. So there's when his daughter dies in Wales in 1863, he's listed on the death certificate. It's not clear whether he's physically there or not, but the father is listed on the death certificate. And his occupation is given as scripture reader. And I'm trying to figure out kind of like what that means, and kind of like, I know there's scripture readers in the army at this point, but also is he working for a church or something like that?
Evangelicals.
Yeah, evangelical society.
Scripture readers.
Yeah. And then later, and that sort of makes sense, because then later in some other documents, like his daughter's wedding certificate and his wife's death certificate and a couple of other things, he's listed as a Baptist missionary. Although the Baptist Missionary Society says they don't have any record of him, but I suppose you can be a Baptist missionary who's not part of the Baptist Missionary Society. So we kind of suspect he might have been a missionary in Palestine, because his daughter marries a Baptist missionary from Palestine, and goes over there. But again, so that to get at, that's sort of following on from what Fionnghuala is saying, that this religious sense he has of himself and religious mission is very much tied up with that, and in some ways I suspect over time becomes the more significant thing. I mean, especially after slavery is over.
Yeah. Question in the back, I think. Yeah.
Given Belfast has got Douglas, it's got Reverend Lennox, it's got all these people coming in. If your business model is to go to meetings and do stuff, Belfast seems to be a bit of a hotspot, certainly in the 1830s, 1840s. Obviously, by the 1850s, that's very, very different. But you're just saying that, you've got Samuel Whitmore Gold Walker. He arrives in Belfast one night in a hotel, off to Sligo next morning.
Yeah.
Belfast is it's very different in the 1850s. Mary Ann McCracken talks about this, just her and a few traders down the docks handing out leaflets. Whereas in the 1840s, Belfast, it was sold out for all the great and the good, the elites are all there to meet Douglas. He's top billing.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting why, especially as you're saying, maybe in 1854, 55, it's a little more understandable why he's not campaigning here. Although he is here at a certain point, because I forget when it is exactly. but one of those, I think it's maybe, anyway, so at a certain point, somebody has received letters from him from Belfast. So he's been in Belfast, but there's no announcement of a lecture or anything like that. In 1846, he comes over to Berwick, and there must be a reason why Berwick, which we haven't quite figured out yet. Although actually, I mean, I think Berwick's a lovely little town, and there was actually quite a surprising amount of intellectual stuff going on there, right? So there's a very sort of well-written minister who's sort of new in town that hosts Roper. There's the Berwickshire Naturalist Club is sort of doing all sorts of intellectual stuff and so forth. There's a surprising amount of stuff published in Berwick in terms of books, and there's a anti-slavery guy who's a missionary in Africa who publishes some books on linguistics of African languages in Berwick and so forth. But he publishes this book in Berwick in about March of 1846, and then spends the most of the rest of the year traveling around Scotland. And this is kind of the same time that Douglas is, and he's never in the same place. But in some ways, the interesting thing is he's also steering clear of the Free Presbyterian Church and all of that stuff, right? And it's almost as though he's going after a different segment of the market, right? So he's not going to get involved in all of this internal church politics with the Free Presbyterians and send back money and so forth. And one place actually says, "Oh, we were disappointed that he didn't do this," but then, you know, he's finding a lot of audiences amongst it's just fiendishly confusing, isn't it? But he's mostly speaking at secession churches and relief churches, and I forget how they all sort of fit together. And I think that's also kind of the point where they're sort of remerging. Some of them are right around then, but it seems like he's targeting a slightly different segment, which maybe, you know, isn't that interested in tangling up with internal church politics, but is interested in hearing anti-slavery stuff. But they do sort of like, you know, he's in a town and then Douglas is there the next week, or Douglas has been there the week before and he's there and so forth. And I do kind of think that he might come back over here partly. He says it's to take care of some business affairs of his wife. And it may have been, but we can't quite figure out what that is. But it may also have been that, you know, Douglas is really, I mean, Fionnghuala is the one to speak to that, but Douglas is really taking off. And he might say, "Oh, good, finally people are going to, you know, buy my book if I can just get over there and print some copies and go lecture."
Question.
Well, and then are they going to hear him? Are they going because it's gonna make them? But I don't view for how does he balance all his trips flying through Scotland? Whatever. If I went to him and speak, can I go up and speak to him and can I give him some money? Will he take that money? These are kind of questions that I go interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll go briefly. I mean, the economics of it are fascinating. His book sells like hotcakes. So when he starts publishing, it's edition after edition, and you can tell how much he's selling because he tells you on the title page. And by the time we get to the end, he's on, I think, 38,000, and that's the second Berwick edition. And that doesn't include any of the Welsh editions, and it doesn't include the Canadian edition. I don't know how many of those were ever printed or sold. The speaking venues were where he sold the books, but he also we found lots of advertisements for sales of the book in Dublin. Can't remember if we found any further north. I think there may have been 1 or 2 places in Cork where it was also for sale, and it was for sale in 1 or 2 places when he was here. But in the UK largely, or sorry, in Britain, it was largely for sale at his sleeping ladies. There's an edition that's published in Philadelphia. Again, we don't know how many of those were published, but that was for sale at the Anti-Slavery Office. It was for sale in Philadelphia, but also for sale in the Anti-Slavery Office in Boston. So there's a lot of that. The book sold for 2 shillings until he put in a portrait, at which point he then charged 2 shillings and 6 pence. Is that right? Am I saying that correctly? Yes.
Yeah.
So there's kind of added value to the portrait. And the Canadian edition, there's a point at which he's selling 2 editions when he returns to Canada in the late 40s, early 50s. He's just published a Canadian edition, and he's selling an edition that has the portrait that sells for 2 York shillings and 6 pence, we think. So that we think that he brought the Berwick edition with him and then reprinted a Canadian edition that doesn't have the portrait, which he sold for 2 shillings. So he's making a lot of money until the point at which he's cast out by price, because at that point, prior to that, he's getting his venues for free. We're not sure how
he's getting his accommodation for free as well. Yeah.
In Ireland, we think he was using the first trip. We think he was using the Bianconi transport network, because if you look at the hubs, then he seems to be sort of moving through Clonmel and around that way. In his early speaking tours in England, those more or less follow the developing rail network. But when he gets into Scotland and Wales and down the highways and byways, we just don't know. He must have had a cart because he was carrying so much stuff with him, or at least a horse. But how he did that?
Is he getting his books for it?
No. But because we do have correspondence and comments where he's saying, oh, could you please be sure to pass this money along to my printers, so forth. So he is definitely paying for the books to be published. There's a good, so when he has this falling out with Price in November of 1840, he then publishes another letter in the newspaper, the London Patriot newspaper, which is kind of the main sort of newspaper for Congregationalists and other evangelicals. He publishes a letter in April of 1841 where he's saying, I'm losing money, month by month. I'm going, it's a disaster. I'm not going to be able to support my family. And he compares his financial situation before Price's denunciation to the situation now. And he talks about how much money he'd made and how many copies of his book he'd sold previously. And that's where he talks about, before this, I would get someplace and I could stay with the minister and I'd give a talk in the church and it didn't cost me anything. And now I'm having to pay for a bed and I'm having to hire the hall and so forth. And that makes a big difference. And I mean, the question about donations is really interesting, and we just don't really have any information one way or the other. Yeah, it may well have. I mean, it certainly seemed to be, as I was saying, he's doing this even after Price's denunciation. He sort of finds ways to sort of keep going, and he's speaking pretty widely and pretty steadily until 1844 when he leaves. But at the same time, it does seem that, again, without this institutional structure to fall back on, it's a little bit like our early career colleagues, it's kind of like you can sort of do it until you can't. And but before he goes to Canada, he's written to the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society saying, I want to go to the Cape Colony and be a farmer and missionary and so forth, but I just need some money to get there. My wife is a qualified teacher and she can teach and so forth. So he's kind of given up on the whole idea of being an anti-slavery campaigner at that point. And then for whatever reason, he changes his mind and goes to Canada instead. We think it's partly because an early sort of supporter and mentor of his, who he was very close to, was immigrating to Canada as well. And we think it might have something to do with that.
Can I get Peter in and then Kira, did you have one? No? Oh, Nick, Peter and then Nick.
Striking. To his previous itinerary back in 1838 over to Douglas's itinerary. But that's very much, that's rural market town in Ireland, not big city Ireland. So it's not the kind of Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Cork, or Douglas's case Belfast as well itinerary. Just speculating perhaps why that might be. There are a number of reasons why it might be, but one of them may be the thing that you mentioned. I hadn't heard of before, that specific organization of the Brookborough Tenant Right and Anti-Slavery Society. The tenant right movement has got a lot of connections with anti-slavery from its first emergence in the late 1840s as a reaction against the famine. So you've got people like Archbishop McGinn, Bishop McGinn, the Catholic Bishop of Derry, issuing a public letter in 1848 likening the exactions of Irish landlords to the exactions of slavers in the Carolinas. William Sharman Crawford, the central figure in the tenant right movement, his daughters are both vice presidents of the Belfast Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. And the Presbyterian clergy, who are the kind of rank and file organizers of the tenant right movement in the north, constantly making connections with anti-slavery on public platforms, tenant rights public platforms in the early 1850s. So it may be that we're seeing kind of anti-slavery shift from being an urban phenomenon. It's may explain why Belfast ceases to be a major centre for the mid-1850s. Anti-slavery in Ireland is becoming much more of a kind of rural concern because of this political shift in the wake of the death of O'Connell. And the rise of, that itself then kind of petered out in the late 1850s. It's not another decade they see a revival of mass land agitation, but at that moment, the early and mid 1850s, it's really quite prominent. I think so. Might be.
That's really helpful, because that's exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to figure out is that, at different times and in different places, anti-slavery crosses with and travels along with other things, and then and it's not necessarily, and even anti-slavery is not the same thing all the time. As certainly as conditions in America change. So one thing, the Fugitive Slave Act, changes everything dramatically, because there's not a safe haven in America, and that sort of leads to this sort of political escalations of the 1850s that culminates with the war. As well.
Yeah, and I know that, just because you raised it, Peter, that increasingly people like Douglas and Henry Highland Garnett, I know, who comes through, are confronting this attempt to draw an analogy between, slavery for life in the U.S. and tenant slavery or wage slavery here, and they're very uncomfortable with that analogy for understandable reasons. But it's coming up. I know there's a mass meeting out in Newton Ards. I think a couple thousand people in attendance, where Garnett's presented with this and rejects it, from the podium. But you can see why it would be kind of bubbling up in these contexts. Nick.
So many things, especially taken with you're talking about, but this break that he has with Price early on, just it kind of reminds me of with Douglas and the break with William Lloyd Garrison later. And I don't know if it's him just feeling more comfortable within his own skin after being educated and really trying to develop that voice of a person who experienced these kinds of enslavement, witnessing horrors in the United States and talking about it, and not wanting to be led by someone who might have sponsored him and made some things possible as far as his financial situation and that kind of thing. But that's really interesting, and it made me think about the presence of African descended people here in Ireland, which Bill Hart, I don't know if either one of you have ever met him, but he's retired from the University of Ulster. Spent decades collecting combing through the archives and finding people of African descent, free and enslaved, living here in Ireland, and the relationship that he cultivated among anti-slavery activists, among religious figures in England, Scotland, and then Ireland. Those relationships are really interesting, but I'm wondering if with the documents that you all have been combing over, if there's much there about relationships that he might have knit with people of African descent here in Ireland specifically, or just if you can talk about it more broadly in England and Scotland.
I mean, the short answer is we don't know, but the longer answer is we also think not. One of the things that's sort of interesting about him is that he arrives, he completely integrates insofar as he possibly can. So he can't be a subject or a citizen. He can't own property, except possibly if he's to go to the colonies. He marries a white British woman. His children, the first child was born in Canada. What's so extraordinary about him is that we have no evidence of him. I mean, Canada at this point is full of African American communities, and there's just no sign of him at all really engaging with them. And we don't know if that's because he just wasn't interested, it didn't work out that way, or whether it was because the structure of his family didn't lend itself to that. We just don't know. In Ireland, I mean, I used to be familiar with Heart's work, and I've forgotten now. It's so long since I've looked at it, but it seems to me that there wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, there wasn't a strong Africanist presence in Ireland ever, so there may have been individuals, and we don't really have any sense of him meeting up there. What we do have in the early days of his English, and in particular his Scottish lecturing, we do know that he will have met with people of African descent in and around Glasgow in particular, because it seemed that the Scottish universities were places where African Americans, Macroom Smith would be an obvious example, but there are many others, came to study. They often became physicians and so on. And there's in one of his narratives, there suddenly pops up a poem written in celebration of Moses Roper after hearing him, and it's by, I'm going to misspeak this, but it's by a coloured man from the Vale of Leven, right? So there clearly are individuals floating around who are coming to hear him, but how do you get at it? This is the thing, how do you get at it? Yeah.
Actually, interestingly, that poem by the colored man from the Vale of Leven is almost certainly one of the very first published poems by a Black British poet. It's written in 1838, not published until the 1848 edition. The other thing about the way he integrates in, he marries a woman in Bristol, has a family and so forth. But it's also important to think about Moses Roper himself and his own background in that his father was white. His mother's father was also the white slaveholder, right? So Moses Roper himself is whatever that makes, can't do the math off the top of my head, but say 3/4 of white ancestry, basically 1/8 Black ancestry and 1/8 Native American, give or take. And in his narrative, when he's talking about his experience of enslavement and escape and so forth, he makes a lot of reference to his color, his light color. And in a few places, intriguingly, he says, I was white at that time. So it seems that certainly at some points in his life, I mean, obviously, when he's, campaigning against slavery and talking about his experience, he's talking about slavery. But we kind of wonder if one of the ways in which he disappears is indeed racially, disappears. I mean, in another way, he's kind of hard to miss because he's about 6'5", he's this great big guy. I mean, 6'5" is, I've got a brother who's 6'6", and, you can't miss him. But in the 19th century, he really stood out, and everybody comments. But in some of these times, it's not impossible that, he's not, I mean, he may be effectively passing for white and just sort of blending in in that way. The other thing I was going to come back to is on the break with Price. It's also significant that right at the time, so Roper's narrative comes out in August of 1837, and a few months later, it might be the very beginning of 1838, there's the American Anti-Slavery Society publishes a narrative of an escaped slave called James Williams. And it quickly turns out that James Williams' narrative makes reference to people and places that don't actually exist. And the sort of pro-slavery people jump on that and say, wait a minute, this is a fraud. And essentially what he had done is he had fictionalized some of the details of where he was from. He had actually been enslaved. These things happened. He was not enslaved where he said he was. He changed names of the people and so forth. But this creates a real crisis in the anti-slavery movement. And I think that some of that concern about imposters, because what makes Roper's testimony so powerful is, and this is what makes him so distinctive in Britain and Ireland, is he's not somebody who, has been to places where there's slavery and seen it and described it, which there's a lot of. He's not even a Black person who, is Black but had been free, or possibly was enslaved when they were a child and has been free for a long time. He's the real deal. He has personally experienced it. He really emphasizes this by using a lot of props. So he when he's in Birmingham, he gets somebody in Birmingham to make shackles and these chains and these sort of whips and so forth, and he pulls them out and says, this is what they gave me 200 lashes with, and so forth. And it's this the directness of his experience, which I think is very similar to kind of, evangelical conversion narratives, right? The importance of personal experience and so forth. And when James Williams comes up and there's this controversy about, oh, he lied about stuff. He wasn't in Alabama. His enslaver wasn't called this and so forth. That really casts that first person testimony in doubt. And this question of imposters in the anti-slavery movement remains significant all the way through. And I did a paper at a conference about a year or two ago about this, where I sort of looked, and if you look in mostly in England, especially into the 1840s and especially in the 1850s, when there's more people around, there's huge concern about imposters. And, is this a real person who really was enslaved? Because there actually are a few people who are like fraudsters and traveling around, but there's also a lot of concern. And I think that's kind of tied in with questions of vagrancy as well. And, this idea, and again, that sort of comes up in the response to Roper. Price's critique is Price is just a very irascible, stubborn, confrontational sort of guy, which is kind of good if you're going up against the system of slavery, but he doesn't seem like he was an easy person to get along with in general. But one of the things I think he's concerned about there is Roper traveling around, just sort of rocking up to places saying, oh, I'm an anti-slavery campaigner, and people saying, well, are you really? Or are you just some vagrant trying to sort of like con us out of money and so forth, and discrediting the movement? And I think that's why he uses this charge of genteel begging. It's not like it's quite a serious thing to be saying about somebody in the wake of the Poor Law and so forth.
Yeah. Anyone else? Last one.
Yes, sir.
Yes, you go.
So if you remember, I said that in summer of 1834, he makes this sort of final escape from Apalachicola, Florida. And he had been for about a year or so before that. He had been working for, enslaved by working for a guy who ran steamboats up and down the Chattahoochee River from Apalachicola, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, up to Columbus, Georgia. So the Apalachicola or the Chattahoochee River divides the state of Georgia and the state of Alabama. And interestingly, this is kind of just at the point where the Creek Indians are losing their land in Alabama. And so he does talk in his narrative about passing through the Indian nation. He doesn't really say, tantalizingly, he doesn't really say anything beyond that. You know, we passed through the Indian nation. But it is a period of considerable conflict, because basically what's happened is Columbus, Georgia has become this big boom town, and you have loads and loads of merchants moving in and selling lots of stuff to the Indians on the Alabama side of things who still have their land, getting them into loads of debt so that they can then swoop in and say, you got to pay off your debt, you'll have to sell your land and so forth. So it's a real moment when this period in the 1830s, when the Native Americans of the American Southeast are being removed out to Indian territory, and Roper's enslaved for a period right on the edge of that. So he definitely would be encountering a lot of Creek Indians. He also, when he's enslaved in South Carolina, he's on the Catawba River, and there's a small but remaining Indian presence there, and he does mention, like, he steals an Indian canoe to escape across the river one time. So the Indians are there, but he doesn't really talk about them much. But the other connection, of course, is that his grandmother was part Indian, but we don't know exactly. You know, this sort of like central North Carolina, Virginia, one of the sort of residual bits of tribes who, you know, basically English settlement just sort of washed over them, and there are these sort of small little isolated Indian communities that stay there really up until this day, and in a lot of cases sort of intermarry with enslaved people and with whites as well. But no, unfortunately, I can't think of anywhere in his speeches where he off the top of my head, yeah, he refers to his ancestry, but I can't remember anywhere where he really talks about those encounters more at any greater length than the passing mentions he makes. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, his grandmother is the last member of his immediate family that he ever sees. So he has this dramatic time when he's enslaved on the Catawba River in South Carolina. He makes a break, and he's going to head north, but he's going to stop by home, and he finds his way back to his home in North Carolina. And they basically say, "Oh, Moses, it's so great to see you." And he's like, "Yeah, great to see you too, but I've got to go. I've got to get out of here." They're like, "No, stick around. Okay, well, stay." So he stays for a few days, and then he gets caught. And they put him in jail, and he's in jail for about a month until his owner sort of finds out where he is and to get him back and so forth. And so he's in jail in the main town a few miles away, which is where his grandmother lives. And so his grandmother is bringing him food, and there's this scene where they're carrying him away, and she's the last member of his family that he ever sees.
On that tragic note.
Yes, that'll be a theme in the biography and the film.
Well, listen, thanks to both our speakers. Really interesting, fascinating project, and we're very grateful for you sharing it with us today. And thanks also to the great audience, which you know, raised some important questions. I'm sure giving you time to think about.
Yes.
So stick around. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes to chat informally. But thanks everyone for coming out, and another great talk on the way, right, Kira, at 4 o'clock. Do you want to announce it? Oh, is this the room? Okay.
It's the room.
Don't have to move. Okay. You want to announce it? announce the talk? Just so people- Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you. Great stuff. Really
Thanks.
good, interesting stuff. Done.